great honor to be here, and I take this opportunity in greeting dear mothers on this Mother's Day. And when I, as a Buddhist, think of this day, it's but natural for us to take our thoughts to all sentient beings, because we refer to all sentient beings as mother sentient beings. And that's because we speak of not just this life, but several lifetimes. And for each lifetime to be born from womb, because we speak of 4 different ways of being born. One is from womb, another is called spontaneous birth. I don't think any of us belong to that. Spontaneous birth is the birth from spontaneous birth is among the 4 different kinds of birth, of which one is birth from womb, another is birth from egg, another is called birth from warmth, moisture, warmth. But this spontaneous birth is special, unique in that there the beings do not undergo upbringing from childhood, but rather they are already mature at the time of birth. So that's interesting. The celestial beings belonging to the form realm and the formless realm, apart from the realm of desire, that's what ours is, they are all considered to be born spontaneously. So imagine being born spontaneously with dress on, shoes on. I don't know which brand of shoes, but anyway, because I mentioned this because partly it is connected with Mother's Day, that we are all womb born, and thus have to have mother to carry us in her womb for those several months, and then endure the agony of being actually born, and then the even longer years and periods of worry, care, concern after each of us. And stretching from there to the Buddhist concept of how we are born from time immemorial, and that this cycle of birth and death can go on and on until one attains, well, the cycle of birth and death, the bondage to this cycle of birth and death, under the condition of afflicted emotions and actions induced by them, could go on and on unless until we make effort and manage to liberate ourselves from this cycle, which is when we would have attained nirvana. And if we still strive further, one could attain full state of enlightenment, that is Buddhahood. So that being the case, from a Buddhist perspective, it's very interesting to imagine being born that several times, and each time having to have a mother. And in such a scenario, we are left with no one out there who could not have served as our mother, that too for several times. So that's the reason why we refer to all sentient beings, including who are right now in the form of insects and whatnot, as being mother sentient beings, and then try to call up to our mind their kindness by reflecting on the kindness of the mother of this life, and thereby extending it to all sentient beings, and then feel not only connected, but also feel grateful to their kindness. So this allows us to feel connected with all sentient beings without exception, at the same time feel grateful for their kindness, and kind of brings a bond between us, which then serves, if nurtured well, can serve as a seed for developing universal love, compassion. And then with that as the basis, then we can speak of the possibility of generating what we call bodhicitta, the mind of awakening for the sake of all sentient beings, and be as strongly inspired and motivated to undergo all that takes to attain the highest state of enlightenment, so that one could then pay back their kindness in the real sense, which is by showing them the path out of ignorance, out of confusion, and progressively into the states of liberation, eventually to that of complete freedom from the bondage of afflictions. So this is how I feel it's wonderful to have a day set aside for Mother's Day. Likewise, we could have Father's Day, Uncle's Day, Aunt's Day also, but each of them could, from a Buddhist perspective, could take us to the thoughts once again of recalling their kindness, of our interconnectedness, despite our ignorance, despite our confusion. Actually, this reminds me of a line in Shantideva's text where he says, there is a paradox in our action, in our meaning, in those of the Buddhists. Those who claim to be Buddhists, they revere Buddhas as their ultimate object of refuge, and pay respect and do their utmost in remembering their qualities, aspiring to achieve them and whatnot. Yet at the same time, they seem to then not respect other sentient beings, no matter how confused, ignorant they might be. They are as equally contributive of as equally contributing to one's spiritual progression as the Buddhas are. And besides that, it's the sentient beings who are in confusion, in ignorance, that the Buddhas, the fully enlightened beings, fully compassionate beings, have the dearest to their mind, and to them. So if, on the one hand, you see reason to respect them, then equally one should be as much caring, respecting, and concerned about the well-being of the sentient beings. So, and partly that's because all of the spiritual qualities, spiritual excellences that we aspire for ourselves, as maybe in most of our cases because of our own self-interest, of this aspiration for happiness, and this aspiration to be freed from suffering for one's own sake. Even from that point of view also, the qualities that we aspire for, that we know for certain would relieve us from the sufferings, both the immediate ones and the long-term ones, by addressing at the very roots of them, are those qualities which we can only cultivate in association, in connection with independence upon the sentient beings. So, more particularly, say, qualities like patience, compassion, is something that we can develop, test, and grow only in dependence, in relationship to someone who is suffering, who is confused, and who may even be, out there to harm us. So in the face of such situation, we can then test our ability to retain our composure and even grow from there by cultivating love and compassion. And that's only possible in the face of someone who is confused, ignorant in the first place, and at the same time, and then from there even more, in the case of more in the capacity to irritate us, agitate us, harm us. So likewise is the case with all other qualities like the 6 paramitas and all these things. We can only develop them, we can only learn them and generate them in dependence upon, of course, through the guidance, through the examples of Buddhas and other spiritual practitioners of high caliber, high realization, yet always in relationship, in dependence upon sentient beings who are as confused and as ignorant, and might even be as as outcoming in their harmful actions that they can be. So it's in these respects that we owe a lot to all sentient beings, from their capacity by serving as mothers, and also from their capacities, more importantly, of serving as the indispensable source of inspiration, source of growth, development, and spiritual advancement. So now if we come back to the very basics of Buddhism, and then try to go beyond that. Let's see how much we can go. But coming to the basics of Buddhism, I'm reminded of a line in the Indian master Aryadev, who is the chief disciple of the great philosopher, scholar, sage, master Nagarjuna, who in the course of discussion with his opponents, and also refuting their concept of what Dharma is, what not. At a point, he was asked as to what he considered Dharma to be. What to him is Dharma? And there he says, Dharma in essence is misewa. The Tibetan term is misewa. Or you could say non-harming. It's the act, the attitude of non-harming. That's Dharma. So then it brings us to the question of what is Dharma meant for? What is Dharma supposed to be? And then he says that, unquestionably, Dharma that we take up is meant to address our very basic aspiration for happiness and our very basic desire to be free from suffering. So this is what Dharma should contribute to. And Dharma which contributes to that end should take the form of non-harming. So it's by being non-harming that one could benefit. And how do we harm? First we need to ask. When we speak, you usually speak of harming, we may tend to get an idea of harming only through physical actions or verbal speeches. But then, in essence, whether or not a verbal action or physical action turns out to be harmful is rooted in the motivation. If we start out with a harmful motivation, harmful intention, then no matter what form a physical action or a verbal action may take, even seemingly non-harmful also, that would be considered harmful, that would be considered violent. So basically, when Aryadev said that it's the non-harming, that's the Dharma, that constitutes the Dharma, that constitutes the spiritual practice, and which would then contribute to meeting the aspiration for happiness and freedom from suffering, then basically that non-harming action, that non-harming, that non-harming scheme, that non-harming action, which we would, which essentially would be the Dharma, is taking care of the root mental state out of which this speech, verbal speech and physical actions come out. If the mental state out of which all these actions start out is afflicted and has the nature of harming others, which it does in the form of anger, jealousy, greed, etc., and extreme attachment, extreme aversion, etc., then the action that kind of shoots out from them are also harmful. But not just that. The very moment we give rise to these afflictions, they are harmful in nature. So with that kind of a harmful attitude, we then give rise to the harmful verbal actions and physical actions. So when Aryadev said that it is non-harming that you have to cultivate in the name of Dharma, and that will only that will help in bringing you closer to meeting the aspiration for happiness and the aspiration to be freed from suffering. He meant that all that counts as a Dharma practice must succeed in addressing that level of mental attitude, that level of mental perspective, that level of mental attitude, and that all our practices in the name of Dharma should contribute in two ways. One is everything that we do in the name of Dharma should contribute to increasing our positive mental attitudes. And then, on the other hand, it should also take the form of mitigating and eventually eliminating harmful mental attitudes. So basically, everything that we claim to be Dharma practice, no matter what physical form it may take, basically at the mental level, these are the areas we should make sure they contribute to. First, of increasing the positive attitudes. Another is lessening the already existing force of negative attitudes within us. So, in essence, the entirety of Buddhist practices arising from that kind of a understanding of what the Dharma practice amounts to, should amount to, entirety of the Dharma practice, be that of a tantric, mystical, tantric, esoteric practice, taking whatever physical forms it does. And be that the very basic, practices in the personal liberation vehicle, or that of the sutra level of bodhisattva practice in the form of the 6 paramitas, whatnot. They are all rooted in this seed of non-harming. So that's why we speak of the Dharma taking two levels. At the very basic level is to stay away from harming others. And how do we stay away from harming others? By taking care of the root afflictions that give rise to actions of harming others. So that's the level of non-harming, taking the form of not harming others. And then, if one can, then rise above that level, go a step further, while maintaining not harming others, then take the step further of, on that basis, even reaching out to others and helping out. So that's the level of the bodhisattvas. So at both of them, the very basic foundation is that of not harming others. But then harming with does through beginning with the mental emotions. So it is the mental afflictions that are the main target of every Dharma practice, no matter what form it takes. And it is at that level, if we succeed in addressing the afflictions within us, that we go closer and closer and closer to a state of lasting happiness. Now, what hope and what and why? What reason do we have to hope that these afflictions can be, which seem very strongly ingrained within us, which seem very, very much part and parcel of our being, to the extent that in certain Western psychologies, like that of Sigmund Freud, these are even seen to be part and parcel of our being, and without them we would almost become non-human beings, right? And the only way to deal with them is by giving expressions to them, not necessarily suppressing them, or in some cases they even advanced to be suppressed. But then, even if we don't suppress them, we need to give expression to them. It may take a milder form of just hitting some sandbags or whatnot, but at least it is advised that one needs to give expression to them. Whereas from a Buddhist perspective, and apart from that, and there is no way out being seen. Whereas from a Buddhist perspective, we reason that these afflictions, of course, they are as strongly entrenched within us, to the point of almost seemingly being inseparable with us. Yet, if we look closely, if we unpack it, we will see, this is the claim of the Buddhists, we will see that there is a component of what we might call misknowledge. Usually it's called ignorance, but here, for the sake of clarification, we might want to call it misknowledge, because it is not ignorance as such of no knowing or just a blank out, but rather an ignorance in the sense of having distorted the reality, having a distorted perspective of the reality. So in a way, it is cognitive in nature, yet completely, mistaken. So it's kind of a misknowledge. So from a Buddhist perspective, we say all these afflicted emotions, like anger, jealousy, and greed, they all are common in that they all share this component of misknowledge for their arisal. And since this misknowledge is the very basic component, unavoidable component of every afflicted emotion, this holds out the hope that provided we make effort and succeed in getting deep down from the apparent afflictions, full-blown afflictions, to its very root, what do you call, misconception, root wrong cognition into the reality of things. If we could get to that level of misknowledge and be able to address that, then it will be almost like pulling the rug under your feet. It's almost like pulling the very basis of the afflictions. And thus, we can then, thus theoretically, it is possible to completely uproot afflictions and lead us to a state of complete freedom from afflictions. Once it is achieved, then that means the stoppage of ensuing stained karma, stained actions arising from afflictions. It would have stopped. And with that, the ensuing sufferings would have stopped. And thus, we would no longer be bound to this unenlightened existence of bondage, of birth and death, controlled by afflictions. We may still be born, we may still show signs of death, etc., but then we would have the control over that. It would be either birth and death under the force of one's own prayers, or it would be a birth and death under the force of one's compassion, where one would be fully in control of where we want to go, etc. Whereas in our usual situation, it is a case of being born and death, being dragged by affliction, being dragged by our afflictions, and being dragged by our karma with no control over where we want to go and what we want to do. So that's the idea. And then in terms of achieving that, each of the vehicles within Buddhism have come up with a certain level of practice. And as we progress along the ladder, we will see how the techniques of doing it, how the paths become, fine-tuned, or they become subtler and subtler and subtler, to the point where we then speak of the esoteric teachings of employing or maneuvering and employing our own afflictions to fight the afflictions, and maneuvering our own physiological components like that of chakras, that of channels, drops, etc., in then fighting against the afflictions at the very root of them, including the very trace of it. Usually the term used for tantric practices, or the way to, a way to describe that is, just as there are worms, insects that are born from eating the tree. The insects, they are born from the tree, and at the same time, they eat the same tree that they are born from. Likewise, in esoteric teachings, although the aim is the same of addressing the very root of our suffering, yet the way to do that is much more sophisticated and much more subtle, in that we apparently seem to be employing our own afflictions, yet turning it around to fight itself. Whereas at the sutra levels, we won't find that level of sophistication, where it would be employing the positive counterparts of the afflictions and fighting them at different levels. When I say fighting them in different levels, I mean in Nagarjuna's text, he gives an example of how at different levels we can fight these afflictions within us, the afflicted emotions within us. one level is depending on the strength of one's own spiritual practice, one could either choose to choose to avoid them, and thereby steer one's way free from the consequences of it. Or one could choose, if one is stronger enough, then one could choose to confront them, the afflictions. Or else, if one is even stronger, then one could then choose to strike at the very root of them. So root here is addressing at the misknowledge level of the afflictions, whereas confronting them would be, say, in the case of anger, as a means of challenging, is coming up with the counterpart, positivity, positive emotion in the form of compassion or patience. In the case of miserliness, developing the strength of generosity. In the case of jealousy, developing the positive counterpart of appreciating the values, the qualities, excellences in others. So kind of confronting them and thereby mitigating or lessening the strength, grip of the afflictions. And then at the very, very initial level, it would be depending on how strong one is. If one finds oneself to be a beginner, then the best is always to look for the signs of such disturbances coming within oneself, and then beforehand kind of avoiding it by turning one's attention to breath, and to just the awareness, etc., etc. So from this we can see how in essence these are all geared towards working at our mental level in two forms. One is increasing the positive attributes within us, like, say, in the case of love, beginning with our love that we seem to have naturally within us towards our near and dear ones associated in our life, in this life. Then using that as a seed, then we then begin to extend the horizon of it, expand the horizon of it to cover all sentient beings through different means. It could be at an initial level through a means of mere prayer, of kind of giving oneself a challenge of whether one can be genuinely praying for the well-being of others, including those who have been very annoying, irritating, even harmful to oneself. So at least at the prayer level, and see whether one can kind of let go of that animosity and let that sense of embracing grow, and then eventually come out in action. So that's a way of developing the counterpart positivities, thereby then having them kind of neutralize. Actually here, the very principle of physics, that of fighting with heat, with cold, is being applied here. And so that's the second level. And then at the third level, as I was saying, mere confronting them up front will only keep us from the afflictions temporarily. Or at the most, one could succeed in kind of, kind of suppressing them, or kind of having them subside for a while. But then, since the root are intact, root in the form of this misconception, misknowledge is intact, it would again, at the meeting of any slightest condition, could again give rise to it. So that's how we say, unless it is addressed at the root, no matter how much it may seem to have subsided or submerged, it would then eventually again give rise, rise full-blown, and then again insight, actions that can then lead us, plunge us into, again, another realm of existence within samsara. So then, as a means of addressing the afflictions at the very root level, of the misknowledge, that's where the very teaching on selflessness comes in. When we say selflessness, there's great room for it to be misunderstood. This is not at all a teaching of completely nullifying the existence of self as such. Of course not. Because when we speak of teaching, etc., we have to affirm self. Without the self being affirmed, self being existing, we cannot have anything by the name of practice, even if that be a practice of selflessness. So self that is being denied is an intrinsic, inherent selfhood. Again, there Buddha was very skillful in teaching selflessness, as crucial as it is in our effort to establish lasting happiness, because only that understanding, not just understanding, we have to begin with understanding, intellectual understanding, but then eventually one has to internalize that to the point of having completely blended, integrated with ourselves, so that we would, just as in our usual life we tend to respond to things with selfishness, likewise it should have been so integrated that we would then be able to respond naturally with selflessness. But then this concept of selflessness is not that easy for us to understand. Compared to cultivating love, compassion, this may be a little easier. Yet at the same time, having been so habituated in the opposite for so long, that the misconception is so built up within us that it is not easy to right away challenge it. And thus Buddha went in steps in teaching selflessness in doses, and thus kind of beginning with a grosser understanding of selflessness, and eventually to seeing all things in the nature of mind, and eventually coming to the Madhyamika understanding of striking a balance between the conventional reality of things, yet at the same time ultimate or transcendental ideality of things. So thereby then coming to terms with the actual reality, actual nature of things. That's at that level, when we speak of selflessness, there it is no more self in terms of self as person, but rather self in terms of identity applicable to every phenomena whatsoever. Whereas to begin with, selflessness began with self as in person, and try to see person in its proper state, rather than in this distorted form. So that's what it leads us to. And so that's the practice, the essence, the essential practice, no matter what form it may take, of someone working for personal liberation. Now, for those working for what we might call universal liberation or social liberation, in the case of bodhisattvas, there they see that mere freedom from suffering through uprooting the afflicted emotions is not enough, because one has to be endowed with the capacity of seeing the very subtle nature, temperament, disposition of sentient beings. For that, there is a need to even go deeper to deal with the very subtle traces of these afflictions. Usually we give the example of onion. Onion even if they are uprooted, they leave some trace of them in the form of smells. Likewise is the case with this strong self-grasping attitude that even if one has uprooted it to the point that now, no matter what conditions one may come up with, one may meet, no full-blown self-grasping and thereby the resultant of afflictions will ever arise, yet one will still be not free from the subtle stains of it. And that can be an impediment for understanding the very subtle realities of others' dispositions, others' afflictions, others' temperaments, others' karmic connections, karmic capabilities, karmic background, etc. And without that kind of knowledge, one won't be able to address the need of others fully. That's what the Bodhisattvas feel even more strongly motivated to then work even deeper and work at the subtle traces of these afflictions within us. And that's the reason why, on top of the practices that the personal liberation seekers take up, the Bodhisattvas require to take their practices a step further in the form of paramitas. And then to expedite the process of not just uprooting, but even dealing at that very subtle levels of the afflictions within us, comes the esoteric practices, the additional esoteric practices of expediting the process of energizing the antidotal components so that the process would be expedited and much more stronger. And that's where the practices of deity yoga, employing the physiological components of our body, such as chakras, channels, etc., and more particularly at the highest yoga tantra, the highest level of yoga tantra, there these deity yoga and other esoteric practices are employed to activate a very subtlest level of mind. We usually call that clear alert mind, very subtlest level of mind. It's almost like in terms of matter, we speak of atoms likewise. Likewise, in terms of the mind and mental phenomena, the subtlest level of the subtlest mind or the clear alert mind would amount to that very basic building block, so to say, of the mental world. So the esoteric practices involve in activating that level of our mental stream, and then employing that into the path, so that although the target is the same, that of affliction and the root misknowledge, going even down to the subtle traces of it, yet now the antidotal component is much more stronger, and that's where we say it can then strike and expedite the process of eliminating these afflictions, and thus that's how we say that taking the tantric practice, provided one has worked up all the foundations for it, then a short lifetime like ours, which spans from 60 to 100 at the most, can be enough to attain full enlightenment. So with this note, I'll stop here. Thank you. Ahimsa is the Sanskrit term for what they have usually translated it into English, non-violence. So this very much ties in to the opening remarks that I made in terms of what Dharma amounts to. But then it's, so in a way, they are almost, in the truest form, Dharma has to be non-violent, ahimsa. In a way, they are very interchangeable. Yet at the same time, we can understand ahimsa from a political scenario point of view. where, of course, in its very essential form, it has to arise from a non-violent ahimsa state of mind. Without that, no matter how much one may pursue, the physical actions will not necessarily amount to ahimsa. So, yet at the same time, we need to understand that ahimsa or non-violence doesn't necessarily limit it to just the concept of peace that we usually have. It could sometimes, provided the situation requires, could take an apparent form of violence, yet at the same time, in essence, being non-violent. So, speaking of which, I can bring in the episode of Buddha's, one of his past lives during his training as Bodhisattva, where out of full compassion he took the life of someone who was going to engage in a much worse karma of taking the lives of almost 500 people that he was sharing the boat with, and thereby gain from their treasures. So out of compassion, out of full sense of compassion, and also very important, here is a component of wisdom. That of his farsightedness, he could see where this karma is going to lead to. So with that kind of confidence, with strong compassion, and with a strong sense of selflessness, self-sacrifice, he undertook that calm action, which would appear to be violent, which we might call violent, but given in that situation, that is as acceptable as any could be. Because I say very important component is that of wisdom, confident, far-seeing wisdom, which we usually lack. So in our case, we would hardly have any excuse to go ahead and hit someone even, let alone killing, because we lack that wisdom, confident wisdom of seeing into the karma where it's leading to. But in our case, what we can do is the best is the motivation. But then, given that we lack that kind of wisdom, in our case, it will hardly be permissible to, let alone taking life, but even hitting others. But there are cases, theoretically, there are cases of what we might usually call violent, yet in essence being non-violence in the truest, most complete, best form as possible. So this is important, and in our daily life also, usually we tend to identify compassion or non-violence to passivity. That's very wrong. To passivity, passiveness, right? That's very wrong. I mean, as much as we are compassionate and non-violent, we can be as active, and we require to be active.
Well, the example of Buddha
yes.
Was certainly not passive. His action was not passive. He took an active step there
yes.
to actually destroy a man's life to prevent him from having a worse incarnation.
Yes. So that's what I meant. I mean, that would be for us a very far-fetched instance of activeness. Yet at the same time, in our own limited ways, we should be aware and should be clear about this idea that yes, being compassionate and being non-violent doesn't necessarily require being passive.
Question else? When that happened to Buddha, that he actually killed somebody, did he
still build up negative karma for himself that way?
That's a very interesting question. At that time, he was a bodhisattva. In the scriptures, what it says very clearly is that even expedited his process of becoming fully enlightened. So in a way, that was a sacrifice on his part. It was not out of harm. It was out of full compassion. It was a practice. It's a compassion being in its most, what do you call, strong, formulated, informed way. And then, if at all that kind of action was going to harm, it was harming himself. So he was even transcending that selfishness. So in a way, that amounted to even a very pure, genuine practice. So that the scriptures very clearly say that made up for several amounts of karma required to move to his enlightenment. When we say bodhisattva, if we break the terms, bodhi is enlightenment, full enlightenment. Sattva is someone who aspires for it. The term sattva means sattva means to harbor an intention for that. So usually we translate that as the mind of awakening, a mind that you generate which seeks awakening, full awakening. But by bodhisattva we mean someone who has generated a specific mind of awakening, not just any kind of awakening, but rather a very specific kind of mind of awakening or mind aspiring for awakening. That is called bodhicitta, mind of awakening. Bodhi is again same, right? If the enlightenment, citta is mind. Mind that aspires for full enlightenment. So someone who harbors that mind is called bodhisattva. The term, the bodhisattva term is translated in Tibetan as changchup sempa. Someone who is brave enough, the term is brave. Someone who has a broad mind broad enough to aspire for full enlightenment for the sake of all sentient beings. So, long story cut short, bodhisattvas are those who harbor, who has generated bodhicitta within them. Bodhicitta means who have developed a genuine, spontaneous aspiration for not just not just personal liberation, but full Buddhahood for the sake of all sentient beings. And that mind, in its truest, genuine form, should be spontaneous. Like we have a spontaneous sense of selfishness, likewise, the bodhisattvas would have trained to the point of having this sense of overwhelming sense of care for others and this clarity of vision of working for enlightenment for the sake of all sentient beings. It's just spontaneous within them. Until then, they are not called bodhisattva. They are bodhisattvas in the making, but when they have generated this bodhicitta, this aspiration for full enlightenment for the sake of all sentient beings, genuine, spontaneous aspiration within them, so that from that point on, it would be just as easy and as accessible, as natural in them like selfishness is for us. So that's bodhisattva. Let me put it like this. I mean, that would be taking Buddhism to the level of bodhisattva practice. Whereas there's even a more basic practice at the individual level. So the essence, usually we say, the essence of Buddhism comes down to compassion from a conduct behavior point of view, interdependence from the philosophical point of view. So philosophically, Buddhism can be reduced to the concept of interdependence. Behaviorally or behavioral point of view, or from a contact point of view, it is rooted in compassion. Compassion we use the term compassion, but it is rooted in the practice of non-violence. At the individual level, staying away from harming others. At a more advanced level of even reaching out and helping others. So the way you put it would belong to that second higher level of service. Yes, of service. Yes.
Do no harm, right?
Yes.
No harm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Do no harm. If possible, help. But at least do not harm. Because when we harm others, actually we are harming ourselves. Because harming begins with the generation of these afflicted emotions. It's when we harm others, we begin with anger, we begin with jealousy, we begin with greed. So in a way, before actually harming others, we already harmed ourselves. And that takes toll on our own happiness. So by taking care of these afflictions, it's a win-win situation. We win and we also let others win.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.